The small town of Clearwater was nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests. Its name came from the pristine lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. Life in Clearwater was simple, predictable, and for the most part, peaceful. But on one fateful summer evening, the peace was shattered as nature unleashed a force that would forever change the lives of its inhabitants. The day had been unusually warm, with a thick, humid air hanging over the town. The birds' songs were muted, and even the usually boisterous children playing by the lake seemed subdued. Old Mr. Hansen, who had lived in Clearwater for over 70 years, sat on his porch and squinted at the horizon. "There's something in the air," he muttered to himself. His weathered hands gripped the armrest of his rocking chair as he watched dark clouds begin to gather far in the distance. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a murky gray, and a strong wind began to rustle the trees. Lizzie, a curious 12-year-old girl with a knack for exploring, had been playing near the forest edge when she noticed the strange behavior of the animals. Birds flew erratically, squirrels darted to their nests, and even the usually vocal frogs near the lake were silent. "Mom," Lizzie called out as she ran back home, her chestnut hair flying behind her. "Something weird is happening." Her mother, busy gathering laundry from the line, glanced up at the ominous sky. "It's just a storm, sweetheart," she said, though her voice carried a hint of unease. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the storm announced its arrival with a low, menacing growl. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the town in brief, eerie flashes. Thunder followed, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very earth. Families hurried to secure their homes, shutting windows and lighting candles in preparation for what they feared might be a long night. Lizzie, ever the adventurer, begged her parents to let her watch the storm from their porch. Reluctantly, they agreed, but only if she stayed close. "It's beautiful," Lizzie whispered as a bolt of lightning split the sky. But her awe quickly turned to fear as the wind howled louder and the rain came down in torrents, drumming against the roof like an army of drums. The storm intensified, with winds reaching speeds that bent trees and ripped shingles from rooftops. The power lines swayed precariously, and soon the town was plunged into darkness. Panic spread as residents struggled to navigate the chaos. The Clearwater River, usually calm and serene, began to swell dangerously. Sheriff Tom Bradley received calls from frantic townsfolk, reporting flooded basements, toppled trees, and even a few missing livestock. He knew this was no ordinary storm. "Everyone, stay indoors," the sheriff announced over the emergency radio frequency. "This is a dangerous situation." Amid the storm, Lizzie couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening. She peered out the window, her flashlight beam slicing through the rain-soaked night. That's when she saw it. A faint, bluish glow emanating from the forest. "Dad, there's something out there," she exclaimed, tugging at his sleeve. "It's just the lightning, Lizzie," he replied, his voice tense as he focused on securing the house. But Lizzie knew better. Her curiosity got the best of her, and while her parents were distracted, she grabbed her raincoat and boots and slipped out into the night. The rain stung her face as Lizzie made her way toward the forest. The glowing light grew brighter, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. As she approached, she found a large, fallen tree with its roots torn from the ground. Nestled among the roots was a strange, crystalline object emitting the glow. Lizzie reached out, her fingers brushing against the crystal. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy shot through her, and the storm seemed to intensify. Lightning struck closer, and thunder roared louder than ever. "What is this?" Lizzie whispered, clutching the crystal as a sense of both wonder and fear washed over her. Back in Clearwater, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Sheriff Bradley organized a group of volunteers to check on vulnerable residents. Despite the chaos, the community came together, helping one another through the ordeal. Meanwhile, Lizzie's parents discovered she was missing. Panic set in as they braved the storm, calling her name into the roaring wind. "Lizzie," her mother cried, her voice cracking with fear. As Lizzie held the crystal, the storm's ferocity seemed to focus around her. Suddenly, the wind died down and an eerie calm enveloped the forest. Lizzie found herself in the eye of the storm, surrounded by an unnatural stillness. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. "Child of Clearwater, you have found the heart of the storm. It is both a blessing and a curse. What will you do with its power?" Lizzie hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of her family, her town, and the destruction the storm had caused. "I just want to protect everyone," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The voice spoke again. "To wield this power, you must sacrifice something precious. Are you willing to pay the price?" Tears streamed down Lizzie's face as she nodded. "If it means saving my town, yes." The crystal glowed brighter, and Lizzie felt a searing pain in her chest. The storm's energy seemed to flow into her, and she collapsed to the ground with boom. When Lizzie awoke, the storm was gone. The sky was clear, and the first rays of dawn bathed the town in golden light. She stumbled back to Clearwater, clutching the now dull crystal. Her parents found her and embraced her tightly, their relief palpable. "What happened?" her father asked, but Lizzie only shook her head, too exhausted to explain. The town began to rebuild, and though the residents marveled at the storm's sudden end, only Lizzie knew the truth. She kept the crystal hidden, a reminder of the power she had unleashed and the price she had paid to save her home. Years later, Clearwater thrived, its people resilient and united by the memory of that fateful night. Lizzie, now grown, remained the town's quiet protector. Though the storm had long passed, she knew its power still lingered, waiting for the day it might be needed again. The storm arrived with no warning. In the small coastal town of Blackwater Bay, summer storms were as common as the tide. But this storm was different. There were no whispers of it on the radio, no radar images flashing across the news, and no warnings to the townsfolk. It seemed to come from nowhere, rolling in with clouds so dark they swallowed the horizon. It was the kind of storm that didn't just bring rain, but unearthed old secrets better left buried. For Mia Carter, the storm would change everything. The night it descended, she was alone in the family's beach house, an isolated cabin perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. What began as a quiet evening turned into a night of terror as the thunder brought more than just lightning and rain. Mia was sipping tea by the window when the first flash of lightning illuminated the ocean. The waves churned violently, crashing against the cliffs with a force that rattled the cabin's windows. She frowned. The sky had been clear just an hour ago, and now it looked like midnight, though it was barely 8 p.m. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from her friend Alex read, "Are you okay? This storm is crazy. Power's already out here." Mia glanced at the lights. They flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of her flashlight app. "Perfect," she muttered, grabbing a few candles from the cupboard. The matches sparked, and soon the soft glow of candlelight filled the room. Outside, the storm intensified, the thunder rolling closer with every passing second. As she lit the last candle, a strange sound reached her ears. It wasn't the wind or the rain, but something deeper, almost like a low hum, a vibration that resonated in her chest. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the storm, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a hum, it was a voice. The voice was faint at first, a whisper carried on the wind. Mia froze, straining to listen. It sounded like someone calling her name. "Mia!" Her heart pounded. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. There was no one there, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Mia! Help! Us!" She stumbled backward, her breath quickening. The sound wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It was coming from outside, from the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cliffs outside. For a brief moment, Mia thought she saw figures standing at the edge, their silhouettes stark against the sky. But when the darkness returned, they were gone. She closed the curtains, her hands trembling. "You're imagining things," she told herself. "It's just the storm." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. Mia huddled on the couch, clutching her phone as if it could protect her. She tried calling Alex, but the signal was gone. The only sound was the relentless pounding of rain against the windows and the occasional crack of thunder. And then came the knock. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm. But it grew louder, more insistent. Mia's stomach turned to ice. No one should have been out in this weather, especially not this far from town. She approached the door slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. Just the knock, louder this time. Against her better judgment, she unlatched the door and opened it a crack. The wind nearly tore it from her hands, and rain splashed across the floor. Standing on the porch was a man, his face pale and his clothes drenched. His eyes, they were wrong. Too dark, too empty. "Let me in," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Mia slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. The man didn't knock again. Instead, he began to hum, the same low, resonant hum she'd heard earlier. The hum grew louder, filling the cabin until it drowned out the storm. Mia covered her ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't just external, it was inside her head, vibrating through her skull. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as the candles flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped the room, broken only by the sporadic flashes of lightning. And that's when she saw them. Figures moved in the shadows, their shapes barely human. They slithered across the walls, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. "Leave me alone!" she cried, swinging her flashlight wildly. The beam cut through the darkness, and the figures recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a kettle. But they didn't retreat for long. With every flash of lightning, they grew closer, more solid. Mia stumbled into the kitchen, her mind racing. The storm wasn't natural. It wasn't just weather. It was alive, and it had brought these things with it. But why? And what did they want? Her eyes fell on an old journal lying on the counter. It had belonged to her grandfather, who had built the cabin decades ago. She grabbed it, flipping through the pages frantically. Most of it was mundane, fishing logs, weather patterns, but one entry caught her eye. July 15th, 1963. The storm returned last night. I saw them again, the shadows and the lightning. They're getting stronger. If anyone reads this, know that the storm isn't just a storm. It's a doorway, and it's hungry. The word sent a chill down her spine. A doorway? To what? Outside, the thunder cracked so loudly that the walls shook. The hum returned, louder than ever, and with it came the whispers. Mia knew she couldn't stay in the cabin. The storm was drawing her in, breaking her will with every passing second. If she didn't escape now, she never would. Grabbing a lantern and the journal, she bolted for the back door. The rain hit her like a wall, soaking her instantly. She could barely see, but she didn't stop running. She had to get to the cliffs. She didn't know why, but something told her the answers were there. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. They clawed at her, their touch freezing and burning at the same time. But she kept going, the lantern's light keeping them at bay. When she reached the edge of the cliffs, the storm seemed to pause. The rain stopped, the wind died, and the shadows retreated, hovering just out of reach. In the eerie silence, Mia opened the journal to the final page. The doorway can be closed, but only with light, pure light, the kind that burns away the darkness. She lifted the lantern high, its flame flickering weakly. The shadows hissed, surging forward as the storm roared back to life. With a cry, Mia hurled the lantern into the air. It shattered against the ground, the flame exploding into a blinding light. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke. The storm howled one final time before dissipating, leaving Mia alone on the cliffs, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. The next morning, the sun rose over Blackwater Bay, its light washing away the remnants of the storm. Mia returned to the cabin, exhausted but alive. The journal sat on the table, its pages blank, as if the storm had taken its secrets with it. But Mia knew better. The storm wasn't gone, it was only waiting, and next time, it wouldn't come alone. In the quiet farming town of Willow Creek, thunderclaps were nothing new. Nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, the town often bore the brunt of summer storms. Yet, there was one storm, the thunder of Hollow Peaks, that no one spoke of without a shiver. Local legend claimed it wasn't just a storm, but a harbinger of things best left buried. A storm that called to the shadows. A storm that returned every 30 years to claim its due. It began, as all storms do, with a change in the air. Ellie Mathers first noticed it while tending to her garden on a late July afternoon. The wind, which had been light and breezy, suddenly dropped. The cicadas that buzzed endlessly in the summer heat fell silent. The clouds were far on the horizon, but something about their slow, deliberate movement toward the town felt off. Ellie's neighbor George leaned over the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice uneasy. "Looks like a bad one." Ellie nodded, though she couldn't shake the weight settling on her chest. There was a stillness that didn't feel natural, a silence so thick it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. That night, as the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the valley, Ellie's dog, Max, began to whine. He paced by the front door, his ears flat against his head. When Ellie tried to calm him, he barked sharply at the window, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. By midnight, the storm was in full force. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the town in brief, blinding flashes. Thunder boomed so loudly that houses shook on their foundations. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against roofs and windows with relentless fury. Ellie sat in her living room, a candle flickering on the coffee table as the power had gone out hours before. Max refused to leave her side, growling low at the door. She tried to distract herself with a book, but her eyes kept darting to the windows. Every now and then, she thought she saw something. A flicker of movement in the shadows, just beyond the porch light's reach. Across town, others were noticing strange things too. Old Mrs. Henderson swore she saw figures moving in her backyard. The Johnson twins heard whispers coming from the attic, though they lived alone. And at the Willow Creek Diner, the night cook, Sam, reported that the storm seemed to stop for a moment, just long enough for him to hear footsteps outside, even though no one was there. The next morning, the storm hadn't abated. In fact, it had grown stronger. Lightning no longer struck sporadically, but in steady intervals, each flash illuminating the world in a harsh, unnatural glow. The thunder, too, seemed closer, as if the storm had descended to walk among the town. It was then that Ellie heard the knock. She froze, her heart racing. Max barked furiously, his teeth bared as he lunged at the door. Peering through the peephole, Ellie saw a man standing on her porch, drenched to the bone. His clothes were tattered, his face pale and gaunt, but it was his eyes that stopped her, dark and hollow, like twin voids. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Let me in. It's coming." Ellie hesitated. Every instinct told her to lock the door and turn away. But the desperation in the man's voice was undeniable. Reluctantly, she opened the door just enough to let him inside. The man collapsed onto the floor, shivering violently. "You shouldn't have let me in," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It follows the storm. It knows I'm here now." As the man warmed himself by the fireplace, he told Ellie his story. His name was Mark, and he had been on the run for days. The storm had started near his hometown, miles away, and it had followed him ever since. "It's not natural," he said, his voice trembling. "It doesn't just bring rain, it brings them, shadows, things that shouldn't exist. They hide in the lightning, in the thunder, and when the storm leaves, so do you." Ellie's stomach turned. "What do you mean, so do you?" Mark looked at her with haunted eyes. "It takes people. My brother was the first. He went outside during the last storm to check the generator. We heard him scream, but when we ran out, he was gone. Just gone. No body, no blood, only his flashlight, lying in the mud." Before Ellie could respond, the whispers began. They started faintly, like the rustling of leaves, but soon grew louder, clearer. Ellie clutched her ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her head, crawling through her thoughts like worms. Beside her, Max howled, his hackles raised. Mark stood abruptly. "They're here." Lightning flashed, and for a brief moment, Ellie saw them. Shadows, long and thin, stretching unnaturally across the walls and ceiling. They moved with the lightning, vanishing when darkness returned, only to reappear with the next flash. But they were getting closer. "We have to leave," Mark said, grabbing her arm. "Now." Running into the storm felt like madness, but staying inside was worse. They fled into the downpour, the rain stinging their skin like needles. Max stayed close to Ellie, barking furiously at the shadows that flickered in the corners of her vision. The town was unrecognizable. Streets were flooded, houses dark and lifeless. Figures moved behind windows, their faces pressed against the glass, but they didn't respond to Ellie's cries for help. It was as if the entire town had been swallowed by the storm. Mark led her to the church, its steeple barely visible through the rain. "It's the only place they can't enter," he said. "I don't know why, but it's safe." Inside the church, the whispers ceased. The air was heavy but still, the silence a welcome reprieve from the storm's fury. Mark collapsed onto a pew, breathing heavily. Ellie looked around. The church was empty, save for a single book lying open on the altar. She approached it cautiously, her eyes scanning the faded text. It spoke of an ancient pact, a deal made by the town's founders to ensure prosperity. In exchange, the storm would come once every generation to claim its due. "It's a sacrifice," Mark said from behind her. "The storm doesn't stop until it's taken enough souls." The storm battered the church walls, the shadows pressing against the stained glass windows. Ellie knew they couldn't stay there forever. "There has to be a way to end this," she said, gripping the book tightly. Mark pointed to an illustration in the book, a figure standing beneath the storm, holding a lantern. "The light," he said. "It's the only thing they fear." With no time to lose, they gathered every candle and flashlight they could find. As they stepped back into the storm, Ellie held the lantern high, its beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, their whispers turning to screams. There's something about a thunderstorm that always feels alive, as if the sky itself is watching, waiting. For years, the small town of Red Hollow had whispered about a storm that struck once every generation, leaving destruction and madness in its wake. Locals called it the Endless Thunder, a tempest so fierce it was said to steal the souls of those caught within its path. Most dismissed the stories as folklore, but for Amanda, Jake, and Clara, the storm would become all too real. Amanda had always loved storms. There was a beauty in their chaos, a strange comfort in the sound of rain hammering against her window. She'd grown up in Red Hollow, listening to her grandmother's tales of the endless thunder. "It's no ordinary storm," her grandmother had warned. "When the thunder roars and the lightning splits the sky, don't you dare look outside. Close your curtains, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers." Amanda always laughed it off, chalking it up to the ramblings of an old woman. But on the night of the first storm, she began to wonder if there was more truth to those tales than she'd ever believed. It was a warm summer evening when the storm rolled in. Amanda, Jake, and Clara had been driving back from a concert in the neighboring city. The highway deserted except for their car. The weather had been perfect earlier, but now the sky churned with ominous gray clouds, and a strange stillness settled over the landscape. "That doesn't look good," Clara said from the back seat, her voice tinged with unease. Jake, who was driving, shrugged. "It's just a summer storm. We'll be fine." But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The clouds weren't just dark. They were black, and they seemed to pulse, as if alive. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, followed by a flash of lightning so bright it lit up the entire horizon. Then came the rain. It started as a light drizzle but quickly escalated into a torrential downpour. The wipers on Jake's car worked furiously, but they couldn't keep up. The world outside was a blur of water and shadow, and the road disappeared beneath pools of rain. "Maybe we should pull over," Amanda suggested, her voice tight. Jake nodded. "Good idea. I can't see a damn thing." They found a small turnout by the side of the highway and parked beneath the shelter of a large oak tree. The storm raged around them, the sound of rain and thunder so loud it felt like the car might shake apart. As they waited for the storm to pass, Amanda noticed something odd. The rain wasn't just falling. It seemed to be moving against the wind, swirling in patterns that defied logic. And then there was the lightning. It struck with alarming frequency, always in the same spot, a nearby hilltop silhouetted against the stormy sky. "That's weird," Clara murmured, peering out the window. "Lightning's not supposed to hit the same place over and over, is it?" Amanda shook her head. "No, it's not." And then they heard it, a low rhythmic whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Amanda's blood ran cold as she strained to hear the words. It was a language she didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. A beckoning, an invitation. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. But Amanda knew better. The whispers weren't the wind. They were something else, something far more sinister. A sudden knock on the car window made them all jump. Outside, a man stood drenched in rain, his clothes plastered to his thin frame. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. "Please," he begged. "You have to help me." "It's coming." Jake rolled down the window a crack. "What's coming?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "The storm. It's not just weather. It's alive. It's hunting us." Amanda's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Before the man could answer, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the area. For a brief moment, they saw something in the distance. A towering figure, shrouded in shadow, with eyes that burned like fire. The man screamed and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the rain. The figure began to move, its massive form gliding toward them with impossible speed. Jake slammed the car into gear and they sped back onto the highway, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. "What the hell was that?" Clara cried. "I don't know," Jake shouted, his hands gripping the wheel. "But we're not sticking around to find out." Amanda turned to look out the rear window. The figure was still there, keeping pace with the car despite their speed. Lightning flashed again, and she saw its face, a twisted, grotesque mask of hatred and hunger. "It's getting closer," she yelled. Jake pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the car began to sputter. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died. "No, no, no," Jake muttered, frantically turning the key. But the car wouldn't start. The whispers returned, louder this time, drowning out the sound of the rain. Amanda covered her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her head, filling her mind with visions of darkness and despair. Desperate, they fled the car and ran into the woods. The rain was blinding, the ground slippery and uneven. Clara stumbled, but Amanda and Jake pulled her to her feet, urging her to keep moving. They came upon a house, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of years. It looked abandoned, but they had no other choice. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. But at least they were safe, or so they thought. As they explored the house, they found strange symbols carved into the walls, along with old photographs of the same storm dating back over a century. In every photo, the same shadowy figure loomed in the background. "This isn't just a storm," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a curse." The whispers grew louder and the house began to shake. The figure appeared outside the window, its fiery eyes burning through the glass. A storm had found them. With no other options, they barricaded themselves in the basement. Jake found an old journal belonging to the house's previous owner, who had written about the storm and the creature it brought. The journal claimed the only way to survive was to face the storm and resist its whispers. "We have to go back out there," Amanda said, her voice steady despite her fear. "If we stay here, we're dead." Reluctantly, they agreed.